the game wants you to have an early death in a spectacular fashion, right? Then it's designed around that. So like, it's fine if you join into a game and you're not good at it, you know. But if you go into a competitive game of any sort and you're not good at it,
it's rude to be bad.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 456 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is February 23rd, 22x4. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. And we'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your monthly donations to help keep the podcast going. Now, we don't have, we've been doing a lot of stuff this week, but it's a lot more of the same. We're just in our big content push for Crashlands 2. So we've just been making, I think, a trillion things. I think we made a trillion things this week.
Approximately.
All of which are incredible, you know, and so no news. You know, you'll see it. You'll see it when you see it.
As just a really brief follow up on the localization stuff, we're in the middle of localization now because we had, I think, 2 episodes ago, we did kind of a deep dive on how to think about localization in video games and how interesting and painful the process is. And now we're in the kind of the fun, interesting phase where the translators are working, and just every morning I just check a spreadsheet where they've listed the translator questions for like trying to get some more context and detail. And there are a lot of ways you could think about this when you're dealing with it. One could be like the annoyance of like, oh, there's just this extra thing I have to do, right? But the other is it's just really interesting to read these questions and be like, oh, you know. So and it gets so much of like so our writer Jen, has some particular moments that are just like very bizarre and hilarious, like writing things, you know. So like they'll have kind of like, you know, a piratey speak kind of a thing, a little more standard, right? But then also some really weird, like some character thing that's just very bizarre that like in English like feels right and it feels good, right? But then trainers are like, what am I supposed to do with this?
What is this?
Yeah, and then watching and then either trying to explain myself or watching Jen try to explain, like try to articulate what does this mean, right? It's just very fun and funny and interesting. So it's been a compelling experience.
And the clarifying questions are also very interesting because, you know, and like, for example, in English, we may have one word to describe a type of thing because we may not differentiate between like sub variations of that thing or whatever, because we just don't. And then like when the translators will see a word that, you know, we don't have any alternative words for that thing. Like, this is what we call it, right? And they'll be like, would you say it's more like A, B, C, or D? Because we have different words for all those versions of this thing, and which one we pick is gonna change things.
Yeah, and some even non-obvious stuff too, right? Because like there's a piece of dialogue where Flux is like, oh, we'll have to figure out how to get across this water, right? And in the moment, when you see it, it's like with the screenshot in the game, it's like literally like, I don't know, 4 tiles. It's like a little island 4 tiles away, this little like kind of portion of water, right? And nobody thought, oh, we need to like provide more context for like how much water is here and what kind of water it is, right? So like the translator question was, is this like across a river or a lake or like what's the vibe of this water, right? Because like we didn't think like we wouldn't have guessed that it mattered for translation, right?
Yeah, because I guess it would probably be weird in that language to just say water when you're talking about a specific
like a body of water,
landmass.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, like I was saying in English. Yeah, you can just be like, oh, look at all that water. Yeah, let's get across the water, right? Yep. And you don't have to distinguish like this pond or lake or stream or ocean. You know, like you just look at it and you can see. So, which is, you know, it's also true in other languages, but like just people have nuances. It's something that I always get on Sampy's case about because in India they're very loose about differentiating between parts of limbs. So if somebody gets like a knee injury, they might just like say, oh yeah, I hurt my foot. And when they say foot, that actually encompasses the entire leg. Or one was very confusing because one of her friends had a shoulder injury and he kept saying that he hurt his hand and he couldn't come in to work. And I was like, what did you do? Did you like get it caught a door? He's like, no, it's just when I raise it, it hurts. And I kept being like, I don't what are you talking about?
Trying to
and then
understand.
after a while, then he was like, yeah. And then he was like explaining something about his shoulder joint because like when he got into like the medical terms about it. And I was like, oh, okay. But like they have the words for shoulder. They just culturally don't.
Yeah, it'd be like calling it water. It's the same thing. Non-specific, right? It's like a general concept of the whole limb wrapped up in a hand or a foot, as opposed
and it's
to
that reminder that it's not wrong, right? It's just another way to, because also like I assume that hand can mean either, basically, like specifically the hand or the whole arm, right? It's like
probably
practically what happens.
Yeah,
yeah, and we have words like that too, right? And it's weird when like they're the same words because that's when these people start to be like, no, this is the wrong or the right way to do it. Right. But it's the same idea, whether it's the same words or different words, right? They don't mean anything specifically. There's no definitions aren't handed down from above. They just are what they are.
But it's kind of what we talked about talking about localization a couple episodes ago, where it's like there's a reason we talk about localization and not translation, right? Because if you just word for word translate it, then some of these nuances of how people use words or how people think about things, they don't really make sense when they come across. So that's been. It's pretty cool.
Well, it works in all directions. I can imagine if you're in India, right, and you're making a game, you want to make it available to a U.S. English audience, right, and then you're using arm when you're talking about someone's shoulder,
right,
right. And you see this too, like with novels and stuff, right? Like the British translation versus the American English translation versus other English translations, right? There's a reason why you rarely actually, even just for kinds of English, you often, like a popular book will get translated into each English flavor, right? Because there's still enough difference that it can be really. I know there's I can't remember what it is, but there's some Harry Potter thing that I think it was like the word punt or something. There's like some moment where like Hagrid says something about punting someone across something, right? And American like readers as like children, like were imagining him like drop kicking a child was like what happening. But what was actually happening was something completely, and I can't remember what it was, but like it was something just completely different. And so the impact that thing can have when like the two readers from the different locales, read that thing, they're now interpretation of this character, right? Like and like the moment that happened changes.
Well, but Hagrid is reckless. That's crazy.
This is why there's one thing that really bothers me about fantasy lore, which is, so if you think about how, like, for example, in like the Tolkien universe, right? It's like, here's the dwarves and they're all like, they've got the same accent and they're all drunk and they all mine underground or whatever, right? So like when I play WoW, for example, they model their dwarves after Tolkien's dwarves, right? And they'll have different tribes of dwarves that live in different areas of the world, but they all have the exact same accent. And they have the same culture and the same like likes and dislikes, and they all mine underground, all this shit. And it's like, if even in our modern world where we have the internet and we can talk to each other across the ocean instantly and all that stuff, we still have so many cultural differences and different accents and stuff, even when we speak the same language, right? Mm-hmm. That the idea of like two groups of people living on opposite sides of a planet, but then just having all the same everything is just insane, right? Yeah. I don't know. That's just a soapbox I have about like, be creative with your fantasy universes and take these things into account.
There's nowhere where people are just all the same. That's just not. That's not true anywhere, and it shouldn't be true in fantasy, right?
And it is very cool to see sort of historically how technology affects that too. Because, for example, like in India, there's 32 states, but each state has its own language. Yeah. But the states are not that big. They're not like any bigger than like a U.S. state, right?
Geographically, I mean? Geographically big.
Yeah. Population-wise, they're fucking huge, right? But and same with Europe, right? But like these areas got established when it was hard to move around, right? Yeah. And so language didn't move and spread that easily. But then like in the U.S., it's a giant landmass where most people speak English, and it's very, very similar English just across the board because it was just easier to move, right? So it's pretty cool. Pretty cool. I want to talk about Helldivers.
Yeah.
Helldivers has been taking the galaxy by storm.
Helldivers 2 specifically.
Helldivers 2.
There's an original also.
So I didn't know anything about this game or this. I guess it's a franchise now because there's a sequel. So I don't know anything about this franchise until just suddenly, actually, it's kind of like my Baldur's Gate experience where I didn't know anything about it, and then suddenly it's just popping up everywhere. Everybody's talking about it.
Yep.
And so we decided we were going to play it this past weekend. So Adam, Sam, and I fired it up on Sunday afternoon, and what happened?
Yeah, servers were all locked up. So it turns out
we couldn't get in.
Yeah, we couldn't get in, and this wasn't uncommon either, because essentially the I guess the popularity of the game was far higher than the devs had anticipated. And then on top of that, there's always the reality that like no amount of simulation stuff that you do will end up, you can't perfectly represent what's going to happen on launch day, right? And so basically just because of, who knows what variety of things, the combination of the scale, maybe some decisions they made that seemed like they would work at the scales that they were targeting and simulating for, just all kind of made it all fall over. So it was very hard to actually get in and play. And it, I guess the high level view of the game though is basically that it's essentially playing Starship Troopers.
It's Starship Troopers,
yeah, just literally,
just straight up. Which is hilarious, and so
the opening cutscene might as well have been in the Starship Troopers movie. Like,
yes,
it's not the same as the book. It's like because the movie's a different vibe than the book, right? But like it's the movie Starship Troopers, just
the heavy-handed propaganda videos
intentionally over the top, so that it's a joke. Kind of propagated.
Like you have to as part of the tutorial, you have to plant a flag and salute it.
Freedom. It's all about freedom and managed democracy, as they call it, spreading managed democracy throughout the galaxy. By basically becoming a little assault stormtrooper, more or less. But I think what's fascinating about it, there's a lot of things fascinating about this launch. One, of course, is the server issues are there, and I think that's been interesting because a few weeks ago we talked about localization and the fact that when players see words translated or perhaps want their own language translated for the game and they ask for it, it feels like a simple thing, right? But the reality is deeply, horrifyingly complex and expensive, right? And not scalable in a way that makes sense across all games. There's no way to easily do this, right? It always is a nightmare. And what I found fascinating about the Helldivers 2 launch was that this backend situation has in many ways, I think, educated a large portion of the gaming community about just how fucking hard it is to build one of these backends that scales. And when we talk about scale here, what we're talking about is they had 500,000 basically concurrent players, simultaneous people
on Steam,
just on Steam.
It's also on PlayStation. Yeah.
And this is because also there's different kinds of backend scenarios you can have, right? But this is one where the entire game actually is run on a server. There's nothing happening locally, really, right? So all the game logic, everything.
There's no single player away from the online.
Yeah. So it's also a very heavy resource requirement on the server side for this thing. Yeah.
So when you combine these two things together, I think what's fascinating about it was just seeing the devs have been very open on the CEO in particular on their Twitter account, basically talking about what's going on, trying to keep people apprised of the situation, which has been very entertaining. And then also seeing some people's responses to it. Again, typically gamers or even games journalists or reviewers who don't know what the fuck they're talking about respond with these kind of flippant things. And then having basically this CEO from Arrowhead Studios be like, you don't understand what you're talking about. Here's what's happening. And just kind of explaining it to them.
Yeah, I saw that one in particular where some just classic gamer move. So the guy had tweeted something, and somebody was like, get off of Twitter and fix your servers, was the response. And the CEO replied to that. He was just like, he's like, yeah, I'll just go stand behind my network programmers and watch them fix it and keep on asking them, is it done yet? And that'll probably make things go faster.
Yeah. And a company at that size, even in a company our size, if I was tweeting and we were having rumpus problems, it's not like I could stop tweeting and go fix rumpus.
Yeah.
Adam fixes rumpus. It's not my fucking job. I don't even know how it works.
Yeah. People have different knowledge and skills.
People have jobs.
Yeah. So what's really fun then is seeing there's a bunch of other devs then piling in on those threads, basically sharing other horror stories they had from their own launches, right? Because this is a very common thing in games. And we've talked about in the podcast a little bit about how, when you launch a game that typically is your highest wave of players is right at the beginning. And so it's weird because sometimes it'll be, 5, 10x, whatever your kind of daily rate's going to be, but you still have to allot for it. You still have to figure out how to do it.
And for multiplayer, that's rough because for a single player game, it doesn't actually matter what the scale is, right? Because as long as the entity that is distributing copies of your game has the bandwidth to handle the downloads, which like any modern one does today.
Much simpler than managing online.
That's it. Yeah. But as soon as you have to also be running a proportional number of servers yourself based on how many users are out there, and you want to plan for that, and you know that you're going to have a 10th as many players in 2 months or something like that, right? Then how do you make sure you can spin up, 10,000 servers today and then not be paying for 10,000 servers in 2 months?
Basically. Yeah. So what's interesting, I think, is this week they managed to get the servers more or less fixed, so you can actually play. Everything seems like it's working as of the last couple of days, which is a good turnaround time. It's a small studio with a small team. But more than the server issues, which there's a lot of articles about, and if you want to go read into it, you certainly can. The thing I found really interesting is while I was waiting in queue, I was like, this is probably not going to work. I only have like 20, 30 minutes before doing baby bath time and stuff. I'm going to go boot up the original and see like, what did they actually change between these two games? Because that's always, we talk a lot about how do you do a sequel well, a lot of the kind of high, is just the high concept that remains, or, do you keep all the mechanics? How does all the systems work, et cetera?
And it looks like the original was fairly popular, right? It wasn't anything like this.
Not like this, but it
was a successful, fairly popular title, right?
Yeah, I think the peak concurrency they had for the original was something like 7,000 players, which is great for like a smaller team. That's really solid. It's not 500,000, certainly. That's like different situation.
That also explained why they planned for 10,000 concurrent or whatever, and were surprised to get 500,000.
Yeah, I think they scale tested for like 50K, being like, that's probably like in our wildest dreams.
They're like, sure, if you
5x better than the first game.
Yeah, take our previous peak, add 50%, and then 5x on top of that.
Yep.
Just for safety margin.
Yeah, and so I mean, you could see how that would that would be their guess. But
that's what we would have done probably, Yeah, that makes sense.
But what's interesting is I played through the initial tutorial, and then I played a few rounds with people. And what was fascinating to me is actually that like mechanically, it is the same game. It is the same game.
Is the first game also like play style? It's like a over the shoulder kind of shooter.
No, that's the thing. So it's the first one is top down. So there's a few things that by moving into full like essentially first person shooter or third person shooter vantage point change that are, I think, meaningful. But the overall, like the tutorial is actually almost the same, but it's got more reading to do, but it's like the same vibe, and it's got the same series of actions and stuff.
And you do the same stuff, right? It's like you got a map, and there's like
it all works the same. It's like
all the same.
The sort of basically the game works by building in certain kinds of what you normally consider maybe like a clunkiness to the weapon handling experience, where it's not like in a lot of like modern video games where you reload a weapon and you just like any excess bullets that were in that clip, you still got them. Don't worry about it. It's fine.
It's magic.
Yeah. And this one, it's like, if you reload your weapon, that clip is fucking gone. So if you do it accidentally early, well, you just lost a bunch of bullets, and bullets are kind of hard to come by, and you got to deal with that. So it's like, you got to be very on it with regard to how you're reloading. Friendly fire is real. You just kill your friends all the time. So
it's also interesting, right? Because also it's part of because the vibe of the whole thing is that you're a disposable soldier in this like infinite pointless war under a fascist dictatorship masquerading as democracy, right?
Yes.
And everything and like the design meshes with that fucking perfectly, right? Because like your life as the player actually has no value. You're not really you're not a main character. You're just
you die in another soldier body replaced. You know what I mean? Like it'll have a different voice. It might be like you can kit out your character with like a specific voice on your ship, and then you land, die within 10 seconds. Someone sends a new pod in, and it's like a woman that comes out, right? And you're like
just a totally different person.
So it's what's fascinating to me is basically the fact that mechanically and systemically it's the same. And what I mean by that is that reloading thing, like all those details about how the gunplay works, all the same. All the details about how their stratagems system works, which basically it's like inputting your like classic, I don't know, cheat codes for an old video game, like up, down, left, right, A, B, A, B, is basically how you then summon an artillery strike or something fucking goofy, right? So while you're being actively, murdered by a swarm of giant bugs, that's a very hard thing to do, which also plays into how the whole thing, again, this like slight clunkiness that's built in that makes it feel very real, as if, you know, your nerves get frayed as you start getting attacked and stuff. And it's not just like a fucking League of Legends game where you just hit R and now you're like blasting a nuke. You got to really
hit a specific combo.
Yeah. The whole thing's brilliant top to bottom as far as that feel. But I think what's fascinating is just the fact that, like, when they went from 1 to 2, essentially like the transition to that over the shoulder thing allows for so many more of these cinematic and ridiculous moments. And also when it comes to, you know, friendly fire and stuff, the reality is if you're top down, if you're playing a top down game, friendly fire is it's actually like constant.
Easy to avoid.
Well, it's easy to avoid, but also it's weird. It's like boring in a way where it's like if someone is shooting to the left and you are to the left of them,
yeah, you just get shot now.
You just get shot. There's not like a lot of...
They can't shoot over your shoulder.
Yeah, I saw
like between someone's legs or like, you know, there's none of that.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of clips of it. I saw some clip where there was this guy just like standing up and he was like charging up some kind of a big laser weapon or something. And the laser then shoots out, starts going, it's like a big plasma beam. It's just like clearly very destructive. And then his buddy is like looking at him. So you can tell she knows like exactly that this is happening, and she like ducks under it, and then something else happens and explodes, and she like gets surprised and then just stands up and her head just like, goes right into this beam. But it's to your point though, Sam, like that's a 3D thing, right?
Yes, exactly.
That could have only happened in this sort of a way.
Yeah, and so a lot of it I think is like the sort of the cinematic experience of it went from being essentially non-existent, and they did a good job in the first one, right? But like that top-down view is just not particularly immersive. It can't really be, right? Versus the over the shoulder thing and the way that all of these elements then kind of interact in that kind of a space makes one for like a lot more just ridiculous shit where like you can't see what's behind you anymore versus in the original. Like it's I had one I played around this morning, and it was like I was just walking and I just stopped for a second and then happened to like hit the wrong button and dive out of the way on accident. And in that moment, this huge bug thing just comes rampaging by because it was trying to charge by and kill me. And I like accidentally dodged it. I couldn't see it. But again, in a top-down context, you can see, right? So you have this combination then of there's a limited visibility.
Well, and either one of those would have been interesting, right? Because it would have been interesting if just suddenly you got attacked and murdered, right? But it was also even more interesting that you accidentally dodged that happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And both of those are more interesting than just seeing the thing, right?
Yeah.
So right before this episode, we were chatting what we want to talk about, and we started talking about the Avatar show, the Avatar live action remake, and about how like just translating something from cartoon to live action causes people to look at it differently, and more people are willing to try it, and it kind of changes the vibe, right? So it almost sounds like what you're saying is like, this is like a live action remake of Helldivers.
Exactly what I was getting. Yeah. You guys were talking about that.
But in a different way, though, right? Because
this actually,
in this way, they actually were faithful to the source material.
Well, it allowed them to become more faithful to the original intent.
Yeah.
Which is not true for like live action remakes of any anime that I've ever seen. But yeah.
Well, it's fascinating to me because it's like I think it's rare to see a game from a like first one to say a second one that doesn't essentially overhaul like a bunch of the pieces that were in the first one. Like when I say the mechanics are the same, like they are the same, the same. Like all of the details about the gun, but the guns are the same. Like the whole, and that's what was sort of shocking to me as I was playing the top down one, because I was like, it is the same structurally on paper.
I think it makes sense though. Like if you got some, it reminds me of Rocket League, right? Mm-hmm. Like the first game was supersonic, acrobatic, rocket powered battle cars or something. And the gameplay is exactly the same. I think there was like a couple of slight tweaks to physics and stuff, right? But it's like it's 3 versus 3 cars playing soccer with rockets on the back. Mm-hmm. And they remade it. Better graphics, better whatever. But the core is completely identical. And I think that makes sense, right? And like it's something that we kind of struggled with when trying to conceive of what to do with Crashlands 2, which is like the creative side of you wants to go like, let's use the source as inspiration and make something totally new, right? But then but the original
it just
works.
needs to be the original, but just more of what just more.
Yeah. And so and it's interesting going back and looking at our design documents, because in our original design documents, almost everything was different in some way. Mm-hmm. And then as we started developing and iterating more, a lot of the things that we wanted to do ended up transitioning back to being very close to what the original was, but more in line with what we wanted the original to be when we made it, but we couldn't figure out how to deliver it, because it turns out that like a lot of the things that we were kind of dissatisfied with our inability to execute or something in the first game really did just come down to our ability to execute and not about what the idea was, So yeah, I totally see.
But I think it's fascinating, right? Because it's like so let's say you launched the original Helldivers, right? And you're like, okay, we had this 7,000 concurrent players thing, active community. It went well, but it wasn't like crazy. We're going to make the second one and it's going to cost a lot more because, it's like the graphics are fantastic on it and it's a big whole new production. But
they do at least get to focus all of their efforts on that, as in like they know exactly what they're making.
But I think that's what's like being able to like have the internal design sense to be like, we're going to keep it the same.
Yeah.
As far as
we made something perfect. We just need it to be more, right?
Yeah. That's fucking impressive. I think that's a lot of discipline. You know what I mean? That's very hard to do.
To then while you're doing it, not actually touch it and not actually.
Yeah. And granted, like what I mean by this is like, there's a lot of small changes in terms of like, maybe different bugs or, like some details, but like the core systemically, like how the whole thing works is just the same. And it's crazy to me that someone could be like, the problem and the improvement that we want to make is in the cinematic experience of the same game, right? But not in the gameplay, the cinematic experience of it. And that's what's going to take the gameplay up to a whole new level and to just be very confident in that and just fucking go do it. On the nail it scale, I think they did nail it. I'm very impressed. Obviously, they didn't nail their servers at launch, but they fixed that now, so you can get in if you want.
Well, but also to be fair, like when it comes to sort of innovation in the like, I'll call it an FPS, even though it's an over the shoulder. It's a third person shooter, but
it's a shooter.
Those types of games are pretty standardized, right? Like even something like Overwatch, which is a class-based shooter, it's kind of based off of something like Team Fortress. But how the game plays is you aim at stuff and hit a button, and like sometimes there's cooldowns on it. Sometimes it has like travel time or whatever. Yep. Maybe the projectile teleports you or something. But fundamentally, there's nothing new under the sun in first-person shooters, right? And so it makes sense that if you've got something that plays really well and really works and maybe has a couple of interesting quirks to it, like the reload mechanic you're talking about.
Or even like the whole like diving prone thing. I don't know who animated that, but that shit is solid gold. Somehow it's just the right amount of funny even when you're just doing it. There's no reason you're diving. You're just like diving into a prone position. And I
had a blast doing that during the tutorial, just leaping forward and belly flopping.
Yeah. Or even backward. And then like you roll around, like while you're on the ground, you can still aim, so as you're swinging your fucking gun around, your character's like rolling around. It's just, there's some weird level of comedy in there that still feels like it's trying to be serious, but also like,
but it doesn't take itself seriously.
It's not taking itself
seriously. I would say it has immaculate vibes, right?
And that's why I think it makes sense. It's like keep the gameplay pretty much as is. The vibes are amazing. Just take it up. Just take it up as many notches as you can in terms of visuals. Take the humor up higher. Even more hilarious, like a goofy combat situations like you're talking about by like transitioning into 3D instead of a top down.
It's stuff that you get to take advantage of that you really wouldn't be able to take advantage of in the first one because of that angle change, which is, again, I think it's just surprising to me to see someone to see a company that can take that vision and actually the design from the original and translate it so well and just get like a lot of benefit out of it, because you see stuff like in the original, you do friendly fire and the person dies, right? It's like, okay, yeah, but you can't really see how they die. But this one, it's like, yeah, someone pops their head up and gets their their head is gone because of a laser beam, or like their legs are just left over after, like their legs are just standing there after an explosive goes off, right? And it's like hilarious.
Yeah, I will say post-death kind of like ragdoll things.
Oh, so good.
If you can do it in your game, fucking do it. Because something that I was really hoping for when they were adding dragon riding to WoW, which lets you fly dragons around real fast, like way faster than any other thing you've been able to do. And I was hoping that if you hit something, you would actually die. You know, like if you hit like a cliff face at like 10x your normal run speed,
it should launch you off into the wall and kill you, right?
You should pancake and your body should just fucking ragdoll. Because I was imagining like questing like down on the ground somewhere and just like hearing a big thump overhead,
and then a body
just seeing a body just flipping down through the trees, like bouncing off the branches. Oh my god, it would have been absolutely hilarious.
I think taking the expendable vantage point of war in this game's case allows them to do these things that in other games where you're supposed to be a hero who's not being disgraced constantly by their actions, it allows them to do this stuff that is just hilarious and so good that just doesn't fit right in most other gaming context.
That's the other part
so
of it,
cool,
too, right? It's like it sounds like they did like a good job with the details of the mechanics, right? But in the end, it's a shooter. They're kind of all the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the way that they married everything else, like the other aspects of the design, like what the story is, why you're doing this,
all of it's
thematically what's going on, how things come at you, right? And like what it means to be working with your team because of how it was designed. This is a really good example, actually, of like the whole idea that like there's no such thing as a new. I mean, this also is just Starship Troopers, right? But there's no such thing as a new idea, right? You're trying to put the right components together to come up with something that collectively
becomes new,
and becomes the thing. And even when every piece of it is not actually new, the execution of it collectively becomes something that it just turns out to be really good in a way that when people are like, I've seen every piece of this before. Because usually, like when that happens, if someone's seen every piece of it, they're just like, oh, it's more the same. Who cares, right? And they move on, right? So being able to put all that stuff together in such a way that everyone's like, yeah, I've seen literally all of this, but I can't stop. I can't stop interacting with this particular way it was all put together.
But what's interesting about this, though, is that this is a sequel, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think of like, okay, so Rocket League is a sequel. Loved it. Never played the first one. Fallout 3, never played the first two, loved it, right? Every now and then, one of these things happens where a sequel comes out that's so fucking good and is doing so many things better than the previous versions that it brings in a whole new audience. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to imagine, like, what would it take for me to play the next Call of Duty game? You know, because like I'm not opposed to playing sequels, obviously, because a lot of my favorite games are sequels to games that I've never played. Right? What's the magic sauce?
I think there isn't one with Call of Duty because Call of Duty's vibe.
Yeah,
because like you don't make a sequel with a different vibe, right? It's the same vibe, and Call of Duty's vibe takes itself way too fucking seriously, right?
That's what I think it is. I've never played it, so like I don't.
Well, it has components that do, but also the community takes the game
it's
really
a competitive
seriously.
Game.
Right? And it's a competitive game, which to me, like, I'm not going to touch a competitive game with a 10-foot pole if I can help it, because you could, in theory, have a competitive game that wasn't full of assholes, but so far, no company has set out to try to make sure that happened with their community. So,
like Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to be coming out within the next decade, you know? Mm-hmm. And like, I played the first Grand Theft Auto when I was a teenager, and it appealed to me as a teenage boy.
Yeah. As a sociopathic
going around,
teenager,
going around hurting people, doing crimes, stealing shit, getting involved in gangs, you know, whatever. But it that fantasy very quickly became really unappetizing for me as a human being. And I don't know if the franchise has moved on from that and like gotten into, you know, deeper storytelling or things like that.
I think this is where the humor element comes in, though, because I think most of the games that end up having a broader appeal, I think end up taking themselves not quite as seriously. And I mean a broader appeal because of course, like if you look at the Steam concurrent charts or whatever else, there's the fact that like, Counter-Strike and Dota, like your very hardcore competitive stuff is still there.
Yeah, they got tons of players. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think what's been interesting is that the things that have been cycling up into that and then, you know, maybe back out after a few months now a lot of them have been these cooperative games. They're PvE games, right? So Lethal Company was just a few months ago where it's you and some friends trying to do dumb company salvaging stuff on alien planets and getting your asses kicked, right? And like a bunch of these goofy mechanics that there's some physics, there's some ragdolling, there's all sorts of funny stuff that can happen. Now you got Helldivers popping up and it's like, it's the same thing where it's like, there's no competitive nature to it. And it appeals, I think, to just a very different and also very large crowd of people who, because of the combination of like the humor angle and the not competitive, but the fully cooperative angle of it, I think just it's easier to just have a good time with, you know? And like, I think it's more approachable in a way. Like,
I think it's part of it's that it's when the design allows you to not take it seriously either, you know?
Yeah.
In the sense of like, you can still try your best, but like if you get your ass kicked, that's actually the intention, right? Like the game wants you to have an early death in a spectacular fashion, right? Then it's designed around that. So like it's fine if you join into a game and you're not good at it, you know. But if you go into a competitive game of any sort and you're not good at it,
it's rude to be bad.
It's rude to be bad at it, and it's against the rules, right? And you'll have a bad time, you'll feel bad, and you'll be treated poorly, right?
There was an article called "Why It's Rude to Suck at World of Warcraft." It was a deep dive into this about like because there are so many ways for people to be sort of ranked, you know, competitively, and because there's lots of I wouldn't say like punishments, but like you can lose, right? Like you can fail at things. Right. And there are so many guides and videos and so many community resources available to you so that you can come in prepared to know what's going on. It is considered, you know, in the community, it's considered wasting other people's time and rude to just walk in and be like, what is this? And like have no idea what you're supposed to do or how to play your character. It's like it's a big faux pas. You know, and so it happens in a lot of these
it's
games.
Something like this where it's like if one person manages to extract from the mission, right, then everybody wins. You get like
who cares?
Who cares? Like you'll get less bonus points right at the very end, but like you just need one person to get in that fucking chopper basically at the end, right? And there's just an expectation of everybody dying all the time in all sorts of hilarious ways. And so
because apparently it's very easy to do because, you know, you can just stand up at the wrong moment and get your head ripped off. You know?
And you just get hit by a stray projectile. And I've also I still haven't got to play it yet. Yeah, because but I've also seen like the scenes when you call in like an orbital strike, like they're not fucking around with that thing, you know, like area. Because I saw some video like somebody called down a nuke or something, and you see it off in the distance, and then it blows up, and then it just kind of keeps getting bigger, right? and they look like it looks like it's far away, but then like they get hit by it wasn't like the actual like explosion, but they got hit by the blast in some sense, you know. And that caused something to happen because they didn't even get hit by the thing, but just like something got thrown as a consequence of this.
You're basically getting tossed all over the place constantly by yourself and other players.
Yeah, it turns out nukes cause collateral damage. That's a thing they
do. Fight like a heavily armored thing, and you don't have armor penetrating bullets per se. Then like a lot of your bullets, depending on the angle at which you shoot the thing, go flying off the thing in the opposite direction. Right? And so it's like there's just
which is not a skill issue in the sense that like you can't perfectly aim your bullets to not have them ricochet off of a curved carapace, you know, and hit your teammate in the face. Like it's just going to happen.
Yeah, but it's like I think that's the cool thing is it's designed to kind of flatten the skill curve, right? Or to flatten the experience that you have at different skill levels.
Yes.
But in a particular way because of the overarching design of everything that makes it so that if you are the kind of person who's really good at this kind of game, you still just get completely destroyed randomly. And so you can't, even if you're a really competitive person who normally plays the competitive versions of these kinds of games, right? You actually can't take yourself as seriously in this one. Yeah. And because you're dying too, even though you're really good at this kind of game, right? And it means that you have less of an excuse to be a shit to somebody who's just bad at this kind of game, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're dying randomly and they're dying randomly, it doesn't put you in a position where you have a lot to say about that.
It's like it's guaranteed to happen. There's no way you're going to go on one of these missions and not just randomly die a few times. Like even if you're good, you know what I mean? It's going to happen. And so I think that's also part of it. It's like it's an expectation difference. It's not like you're not expected to be flawless or somehow, or that it's like a problem. Which I think is just fabulous.
I think the part is the community vibe has been because I haven't actually played yet. I'm just like seeing people talk about it and like clips going out and stuff, you know. But the community, like something about the overall design of the game and like the disposability, I think, of the player in particular, has made it so that the whole community is just like they're in on the joke, right? So that when a player dies, they're making jokes about, you know, it's for democracy. Like everyone's just like yelling the slogans of this fascist dictatorship, right? Like, and everybody, like everyone's in on the joke.
And of course, nobody knows why killing a bunch of giant bug aliens is somehow helping democracy, but that's what the propaganda says. So let's get on board.
I mean, you see like when they finally implemented like AFK kicking. So people who were, if you're logged in, but you haven't actually been moving or played for 15 minutes and you get kicked out, which they didn't have at the beginning, which is part of the reason why the concurrency was so high, because everyone's just leaving their fucking computers on overnight since it was so hard to get in, etc. So they finally put that in, but the way it was framed was also funny in both the player and even the media, where they're like, now like undemocratic AFKers are kicked out, kicked out of the thing, right? So it's like, because they hate democracy, and so which again it's all about this satire of tongue in cheek. Like, if you just call everything good democracy, and everything you don't like undemocratic, then that's how propaganda works.
I love that. I think any game like this
with these really strong thematic elements where it gets all over everything, and it's just it ends up being a little fun joke itself.
I haven't seen anything.
Cult of the Lamb is also good, but
I haven't seen anything that had this level of
same
sort of cohesive buy-in where everybody is like on the same page with the game.
Yep.
It's weird. It's weird. I mean, it's delightful, and it's a fascinating cultural phenomenon.
I think it has to be because of like the cultural memory of like Starship Troopers or something like that. It's in there, right? And so like I don't know, there's something about like what it is asking of you, and it's fun to participate in. Also, is because like you said, it's not taking itself too seriously. So the whole thing is supposed to be fun, and I think that just like
it's fun to RP as part of a brainless mob.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
But just take your brain out, just set it on the shelf, and get in there and just start shooting.
It reminds me of like the Wall Street Bets thing. It's like the same energy. People being like, my brain is so smooth, diamond hands, right?
Everybody in that community just talks about how stupid they themselves are for the things that they are doing, and everybody is like, "Wow, this is so dumb! I can't wait to see what happens." They're like, they're all in on the joke, but also it's not exactly a joke.
It's great. That's really well done.
Yeah. We guys think we have time for one question? I think we can get one.
We got time.
All right. Highest upvoted question from podcast.bscotch.net comes from Lexzap, who says, I was reading some historical quotes from the 1984 to 1987 complete games industry crash, which is, I assume, a book. The market is flooded with quickly made low-quality games. Publishers are solely focused only on making sequels of prior successes. Developers are spending more time on marketing than developing. Game companies begin mass layoffs as customers turn their backs on gaming. So in your opinion, is 2024 headed in the same direction as 1984?
Nah, I would say
so. You could take that combination of sentences,
just put it anytime,
print it every year since then, and people will be like, "Yeah."
It's the same thing as like you'll see this of like people complaining about kids not wanting to work these days.
Nobody wants to work these days. Nobody ever wanted to work.
Who the fuck would want to? That's just such a stupid position to take. But you can go back, like somebody strung together. They found like old newspaper clippings, and they managed to find like from like the early 1800s to today, just like headlines or opinion pieces or whatever, just like they could take a little clip from that just said the same thing.
For like generational differences or
about young people being lazy, right? And they just strung that together for 200 years, and they were like, have we really gotten 200 years worth of lazier? For like, is that what's happened, right? Or is it just that this is the claim you could literally make at any time because people are different?
Well,
and when you get older, like it looks different. When you look,
I think what it is like
people are doing now
feels it's a truth in part, and that's basically it's always a truth in part, right? Which is like when you're looking at something like this about the video game stuff, like it has always been that there's a bunch of these games coming out that basically are like they're not really doing anything, right? They are lower quality, and also like they're not destined. No one's going to play them in a very long term capacity or whatever. That has always been happening, and then the publishers are. And even just like big game companies, basically investing in like starting a new IP is so fucking expensive and insane because again, you don't know if people are going to show up. So it's not that it doesn't make sense. It actually makes so much more sense to do a sequel or a franchise thing. It does, like just always.
If something works really well, do it again, but better.
Yeah. From a business investment standpoint. And so I think what's funny about it is like,
but also a survival standpoint, as in like,
yes,
because there's when you're thinking about like why things are the way they are today for anything, right? There's a component of it that's important to not disregard, which is like it's this way because the things that survived are this way, right? And so if you have a company who's taking repeated gambles on new IP, right? Yes. One of those is going to fail, and if that company's not managed really conservatively,
then the company dies.
Then the company also fails, right? And so most companies that like really gamble on new IP fail eventually, right? But if you already have something successful, you can find a way to leverage it, then there's a good chance that you don't die. And therefore, the surviving companies are increasingly, the ones that are just remaking the same stuff. And the new entrants, the ones that are trying to make new stuff, are necessarily younger companies with less resources, right? Because they're the ones who haven't failed yet.
And what you really see with stuff like this is, in my opinion, there was no games industry crash. There was a crash of a trend, which is what happens with trends. So like there was a big, like when we talked about this pretty recently, there was a big spike in people making VR games in 2017, 2018. And what happened?
Yeah.
Almost none of those games succeeded, right? But like almost every new indie studio we talked to at that time was like, VR is happening. It's finally happening, right? It didn't happen.
And most of those studios don't exist anymore.
Yeah. But of course, like that also happened about 7 years before that, and 7 years. But like VR kind of comes like locusts, right? Like about every 7 years, you get a big spike of VR stuff. And it's like, it's finally happening. And then it doesn't happen because nobody wants to wear something on their face, as we've talked about, forever. The big trend back in the 80s was people overestimating the market for video games in general. Because like there was no internet, you still had to have physical copies of things. People had to get the Atari hardware and take over the TV and stuff like that.
Actual production and distribution is way more expensive in that context.
Yeah, and like that it's a bubble. It was a bubble, right? And it's a bubble because one of the leading game consoles at the time was the Coleco, which stands for Connecticut Leather Company, because a fucking leather company decided to get into the games industry because they thought there was infinite money there, right?
Yeah, so it's like one of them launching a crypto coin.
Crypto was another
see
trend,
like
right?
how much of the market is actually just propped up by investors. That's the other signal, right?
Yes.
And I think in the video game space right now,
bubbles,
it's actually not like there's still a lot of the things that are currently failing are the stuff that's all investor propped up, right? But there's also why we're going to have an AI crash in the next year or two, right? Because right now all of AI is
just so much money going into
propped up by investor money, right?
But what that functionally means is just
the same as the .com crash, right? It's
which is there will be a lot of companies trying to incorporate AI or use AI to do stuff, and it turns out they're not actually solving a real problem. And there's no market for what they're doing, and then the company collapses, and then there's layoffs or whatever. It's like, well, that's not something fundamental about AI. It's just that
it's about
it was
it's about doing the wrong thing.
Yeah. And it also doesn't mean that the trend will go away, right? So like there will still be people using VR for all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
It's just it's not probably not going to have
VR
that
itself has survived every crash that's happened in the VR
It's always
space,
been around.
Yeah. The companies involved have mostly not survived the crash, but some have. And there are some companies who are still around making VR stuff, right? Because they've specialized in it, they're good at it, and their company matches the market for the product, right? They're not the ones that are not just investor propped up.
I was going to say, yeah.
Of people imagining that money will come someday, when VR takes off and becomes the next big, infinitely growing thing, right? So I think what we're looking at today is we're currently in the middle of an investor propped up crash in everything.
Well, also partially because of COVID, right? Like everybody works from home, everybody's stuck at home. Video games did well.
They did obscenely well
during COVID.
Obscenely well during COVID. You're talking
and of course, people project, they're like, wow, suddenly video games are making this much money. That trend is going to continue.
Yep. So then investors throw all their money, and then the investors demand infinite return. And so then people hire infinite people and they start infinite new projects. But the market wasn't going to be there. And what we've been seeing in the market is the market has been returning to what it would have been if COVID didn't happen, right?
Yeah,
like, people are treating it like the market's not going, the market's not going back to pre-2019. It's going back to
where it would have gotten to if
where it would have gotten to, yeah. So but that's a huge difference. There's a huge gap between that and what all of the investor money thought was going to happen, right? And so what we're seeing is the fallout from that, which is why people call it a correction, which is a very academic way to describe a horrible collection of things that are happening.
But I think if you're talking about crash though, because it still is. Because they're basically saying it's not a crash of the games industry; it's a crash of basically a financial model of
the games industry was totally fine as an industry.
Well, but what I'm saying is
the games industry is still worth $150 billion.
Oh
yeah.
The
industry is there.
What happened? Yeah. But what happened as far as the actual total valuation of, or the total revenue, or whatever else of games during that time. Because I think there was a time where like actually the revenue of the thing like actually dipped because the customers fell out, which is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about two different things, right? Because
it was kind of a combo. Like the customer base, I don't know if it declined, but one of the issues that happened was like a lot of the companies that jumped on the trend to make their own gaming console, those companies collapsed, right? And so they're like, if you bought one of those consoles and there's no more games coming out for it or whatever.
Yeah, I think it was something like that, where like a couple of those collapses because it actually caused a loss of consumer interest, right? But I think that's what.
Well, but it's also because of the degree
from the current mix, right?
Well, there was the degree of enshittification where that was happening, right? Yeah. Where everybody was trying to extract infinite wealth out of there, but the pool, suddenly the number of people, again, who are like investor propped up entities who were competing for actually not infinite space in the market, right? Made it so that they were just they were content mills, right? So they were just churning out shitty games. And back then, there was no way for you to be like, what are the best games right now? Right? You would just, it was like whatever's in the store is what's available. So the stores are getting overwhelmed with stuff they can't evaluate in terms of like, so what's on the shelf, right? So everyone is getting burned and burned out, right? With what's happening at that time. And the same with it, like if you go onto like Switch today, like an uncurated platform, right? It's like you buy first party titles because that's the only thing that Nintendo surfaces to you that you can be confident is going to be good, right? Because they have no other mechanism, right? Mostly. Yeah. Versus
some
like
of the new Pokemon games, people did not like that much.
But versus like Steam, where Steam today has invested all of their effort into discoverability, so that the market that they're trying to match players to publishers, basically. That they're able to surface, theoretically, right? But surface the right content to the right people. Yeah. And there's a reason that's where all their investment has gone into, right? Is that's what prevents a collapse when you have this mismatch of what the players want and what they're getting.
I would say it lets the kind of financial and the investor portion of the collapse happen, but the actual, like, there's not a collapse in interest, which I think, because like as far as the quote goes, that is
the interest is still growing, actually.
Yeah, the quote basically says like this leads to like customers or whatever. So it's kind of like customers losing interest, right?
Customers turn their backs on games.
Yeah, I was like, that's not happening at all. Like you might turn your back on
nobody ever stopped wanting games. Yeah,
a company, right, at this point, but you're not like Blizzard, for example. I think is going through this, right? A lot of people are like getting a little less into buying immediately whatever they're offering, right? But they're not buying something else because there's other.
I'm unlikely to buy another Blizzard game ever.
Yeah, right.
Because I know that it's going to be absolutely riddled with in-app purchases and all that stuff. And
the same thing with an EA title and so on, right?
Yeah. But there's so many other companies serving the need. Basically, what I'm saying is like the key component is that the market does not actually shrink in this context because customers actually always have other cool things that they can go get. But you might still have the background fallout of like particular companies just dying off or being killed off. You're seeing
collapses of business models that are propped up by investors where the business model assumes infinite growth or that some particular trend is going to grow enormously. And this is why, because we just went through the NFT bubble, right? There's still a handful of games coming out that have NFT stuff because it takes a long time to make games and they try to get on that trend. Whoops. But you can describe that as a collapse too, right? And it was where any company or game that was propped up by investor money for NFTs that collapsed. And if the company was big enough that it could handle that collapse, like Ubisoft and EA, right? Then they basically like fired a bunch of people and shut down a bunch of like studios that they had bought, but the broader company still exists, right? And so the broader company gets to survive as they chase the trends and do all this story.
I think what you say then is that like in that context, especially because in that context you do have customers eventually realizing that these things are not good and useful, so they stop participating in that kind of a game, right? So if you see, I don't think now, I think now, not games, but what I'm saying is like now if you see like an NFT game, my assumption is that is one of the kinds of thing that is made, right, in the space that people do turn their back on more so now. And so you do have that actual full circle thing happening, right? Yeah. As far as crash.
So the nuance is like the part of the market. Because if you look at the late 80s crash, like people are tired of them being exploited by an infinite amount of like piling up garbage consoles with garbage games, right? And what they were struggling with was finding good hardware and good games because
which
at
is just
the time
not
it
the
was
problem currently.
Yeah, because it's when one of these crashes happens, it's because there's a fundamental there's a misunderstanding on the business side about the fundamentals of the business, right? So like, why is it that Nintendo came out of the 1980s
quality seal
crash? It's because they put a chip in their cartridges that was encrypted that only Nintendo could produce the games that worked on the Nintendo console. So it was an old school way of saying, we have a curated platform where we guarantee that every game that you buy for this will be good, right? It may not be, the best game ever, but like we only have good games.
And that's not even to say that that's an ethical or appropriate strategy, but that is
what people want,
and it
right?
Works,
because again, it's not that people don't want games. People don't want shit games, right? Like people don't want to waste their time, and they don't want to waste their money.
They don't want to waste their time. Yep.
Yeah, then they don't want to have to spend. They don't have to spend hundreds of dollars at that time subscribing to magazines to read reviews to figure out which games they should buy and which ones they should avoid, right? And so similarly, like we had all these kinds of conversations when we first started making games, and we were coming onto the mobile platform where there's thousands of games coming out per week, almost none of which people wanted, right? And
almost none of which anybody ever plays.
And if you look at Steam,
and it's a misunderstanding on the part of of Apple or Google to just be like, yep, people want games, just infinite games. We just all the games, right?
Which is why you now have Play Pass and Apple Arcade, right? Because
they had to make whole new platforms to curate stuff because it turns out that that's a useless model. Nobody wants that.
And if you look at something like Steam, I mean, nowadays you're looking at like 180 to 250 games a week coming out on Steam, right? Yeah. But what's great about it is if there's there's called the ICO newsletter, ICO newsletter, so you can sign up for that. You get a little digest in your inbox, and it shows you the number of games that came out on Steam, but then also like review buckets. So how many games had more than 10 reviews?
Oh God, is it like 1%?
It's like maybe 20 games. 25 games
out of the 150,
out of the 200. Yeah. So it's like 10%. But that's like 10. Which is, that's like the floor, right? And then if you look at, and it shows you all the top ones, and it's like there's basically a dozen per week that have essentially like enough reviews that they got bought a number of times. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that they may have at least broken even on their investment.
Yeah, maybe. And so it's fascinating to look at because it's like, oh, right. The problem is just not that there's bad games. It's just being able to sort them in a way where you can tell and pick the ones that actually are good right ahead of time. And I think just in modern day gaming, like all the platforms have chosen their methods for dealing with this. Some more scalable than others, but I don't think it's a case that anybody's going to stop playing gaming because
I think games are a weird space when it comes to this whole like crash cycle and stuff, right? Because you do have people who are running companies and they're making games as a business intentionally. Like their goal is to make and sell games and survive as a business doing that, right? But you also have a lot of companies and people who are putting out games because they love games, but they want to make games, right? And their goal isn't specifically to generate revenue off of it, right? And so it's a weird market for that reason because you have these like really high investment products that you're making, right? But where the people involved aren't even necessarily like they hope to, like, but if you talk to most indie devs, they're kind of treating it like the lottery, right? Where they're like,
sort of half and half.
I hope it works out, but like if it doesn't, it's fine that I spent 3 years of my life like doing this in my off hours, or that I quit my job for 3 years to do this, and then I'm to go back to work if it doesn't pan out, right? You don't see that in other kinds of media or other kinds of business, and so that's a lot of why we have like just the sheer volume of stuff coming to the game space, but also where there isn't very much stuff that like has any likelihood of actually generating a return on the investment that went in, right? Because the people are not coming in for that purpose, I guess, right? And even if they were, I guess the problem is like there's always going to be a lot more coming in than could be supported by the market because
because there's a speed limit on quality. Like look at what's going on with Disney Plus, right? Like or I guess Marvel specifically. Way too much. There's way too much of it. There's way too much Star Wars. There's way too much Marvel. Like if 10 years ago you had said to me, hey, do you think that in 10 years you'll be exhausted by how much Marvel and Star Wars stuff there is available?
I would have said no. I want as much as possible. Yeah.
Yeah. But it turns out
I don't want as much as possible.
It turns out you want to be able to enjoy it and sit with it and give it time, like give it the time to like marinate in your brain and talk about it with people, right?
I mean, it's not even about quality, I would say, because there are a bunch of shows that I know are supposed to be good.
It's about time.
Yeah, it's about the sheer volume where at some point you just get overwhelmed. And because games are a shared communal experience, even when, even single player games, you play games that people have played or that people are talking about, right? And so it's people's time is a finite resource, and people are going to aggregate towards the stuff that other people are playing. And so necessarily that just means there's only a finite, not ever growing. There's a proportional number of games that can succeed in the market, right? And there will always be a lot more games being made.
Same with shows, same with movies.
Same with all of it. Yeah.
There can't be 200 successful movies a year. There just can't.
Yeah.
There
but
can
it's
be
been true forever, but
15,
but when the shape of how these things get made and distributed changes, right? Mm-hmm. And when there's a trend that people are chasing because they think there's money there, right? That's what causes these waves and troughs, right?
But it's interesting how it's immune to normal business logic, right? So if you think about let's say you're the CEO of Disney, right? And you're like, wow, we've got these every time we make a Marvel movie, it makes $500 million. Let's just make twice as many. Let's make 4 times. Let's make 10 times as many, and we'll just get 10 times as much money. And it turns out you just get the same amount of money because people
the limit
only
is
have so much
time and interest. Yeah.
And so what people fail to realize that they already were at the cap, and they just keep pumping out more and more volume. Whether you're a platform, putting out 7,000 games a week on your platform, or whether you're a company actually producing the content, putting way too many shows out.
There's an interesting thing which because I just finished reading this book called Same as Ever, which is very good, but it's just about all the stuff that stays the same over time, right? And one of the points is that a lot of the systems that we participate in, or even just the way that people work too, is to naturally push things beyond their point of being the optimal level, right? Because you don't actually know when you're at the optimal level. There's no fucking light that turns. There's not a game where you're S tier, you did it. No, there's no. Yeah. So you always, if something's going really well, you'll see this, and you see this with game studios. You push it further, grow the studio bigger, make the games bigger. You're seeing this in the AAA, quadruple A space now, frankly, with how big these budgets are. But you see this with Disney, right? It's you don't know if you're at the limit yet, and so
until it starts to decline.
Until you actually push it too far, and then the problem is that typically pushing it too far causes a lot of shit to explode, right? You got to lay off people.
It's because the cost, because it takes a long time to make stuff, and it takes a huge amount of investment into people, infrastructure, et cetera, right? And I mean, taking also all the way back to the simple case of servers at launch, right? Mm-hmm. It's if you're ooh, this game is going to be just a fucking blockbuster, right? It's going to be the big, because the last game we did really well, so we should plan for 10x on this next one, right? So then you pay for the resources to have 10 times as many servers running for your new title and so on, and then it turns out that there was only support for 2x, right, of what you had previously, or the same because you'd already saturated that market. Now you've got all these resources you spun up, right? You bought those. They're in a warehouse somewhere, right? A whole bunch of people are staffing them, or you rented them from some other company. They increase their infrastructure to compensate, to handle what the stuff is that you're doing. And all of a sudden you're oh shit, turns out we didn't need that. Mm-hmm. Now your investors are upset because they're not going to get their money back. So they start demanding blood. So now you start firing more people even than you should have.
Again, right? The whole thing. It's it all falls apart. The whole thing.
Yeah. And that's why you have these boom bust cycles where it's always people overinvest and overcorrect is basically the cycle. That's why things don't just have because things are actually generally the line is going up on everything all the time.
Oh, right? Yeah. The games market's been growing every year, tremendously.
Yeah, the whole time. But what you see around, at any given moment, though, it's way above or way below the line, right? Because of the overinvestment and the overcorrection. Because like Sam said, you can't predict
you don't know where top. You don't know when you've hit the limit of something.
And even then, even when you've seemingly hit a limit, you still don't know why, right? Because so say you're Disney, you're pumping out 100 Marvel movies a year, right? Is the reason that you're starting to now lose money doing that, is it because you're putting out so many Marvel movies, or is it because everybody else is also doing this with their IP, right? And so the whole market is saturated, even though there actually would have been, if they weren't doing it, there would have actually been room for your 100 Marvel movies.
Oh, yeah.
Because
there's just no way to know.
Maybe there's no way to guess. Everyone is actually kind of I'm not going to go see these anymore because I can't trust that they're good, which is actually what was happening before. There's so many reasons. So then you could go back to bat again and be Well, we think it was this other thing. So let's
yeah, we think it was because the quality wasn't good enough. So it's not the volume or vice versa, right? And because there's no way to know, because it's easy to look at this from the outside and be like, Disney's so stupid doing this, obviously, right? But these are what we call the just so stories, right? It's like you can make up a story that like sounds very reasonable, right? But that doesn't mean it's the truth, right? And the reality of doing all this business stuff in these markets is that there's no way to know why a thing worked. There's no way to know why a thing didn't work. You can make some guesses, right? And you're going to do some stuff based on those guesses, but those guesses, who knows? And also just because even if you were right, that doesn't mean that reality is what the reality looks like 2 years from now. Mm-hmm. So it just is chaos. It's just pure fucking chaos out there. And it necessarily because of how people do business, which isn't a good thing. Right. Yeah. And how people think about stuff, which again, I'm not saying this is good, but because of how people do it, you get these overinvestment and overcorrection cycles. And we'll just keep having that indefinitely until
it'll happen every couple of years.
Yeah. It's just going to keep happening.
Yep, it just happens.
New trend gets chased, it collapses, and then, and some stuff comes out from it. Right. So right now we're in the AI bubble right now. Like I said, there's useful stuff in there that's going to come out on the other side and survive it.
AI is going to keep being there forever.
Yep. Yeah, AI, but VR is going to keep being there. Like all these things are going to keep being there, right? And they're going to have their niche, and their niche is going to change over time, right? But at any given moment, we're in the middle of some boom bust cycle,
some hype.
There's always because people chase the hype because of the fear of missing out. Because it is true that if it turned out that was a thing to chase and you didn't, it's unlikely you'll be able to chase it after that, right? Because it takes so long to capitalize.
Well, you know, what is it? Right? Live by the sword, die by the sword, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Our philosophy is stick to the basics.
Just
right?
use knives,
we're just like people are not fundamentally different organisms than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, right? Like cultural context changes and stuff like that, but human psychology is pretty well.
We've lived through the death of indie games, like, I don't know, 3 times now or something, right?
It just keeps happening.
Yeah. And that core idea is that we believe that people like video games, right? And that if you make a good video game, basically kind of any sort, right? That there's still a good chance you can make a game that just turns out nobody's there for it, right? But we don't believe you need to chase like the fads to get there, you know?
You don't need a VR game. You don't need an NFT game.
You can still make successful 2D titles, and
people are still playing chess after all this time, even though, you know, the meta hasn't really changed much. Maybe you know, it's not like if somebody makes VR chess, then chess is dead and it's all VR. Like, no, like chess will still be around because it's a great game, and that's all that it takes. You know.
Well, and the trends are how you get lucky and make $1 jillion, right? They're also how you get unlucky and your business collapses.
Yeah, you're nearly guaranteed.
Yeah, most of the time you're going to, but of course, like the survivorship bias is what we see. We see the stuff that lived, and so it makes you want to chase the trends. Right?
Yeah, you see that one dude who had like 800 bitcoins on a hard drive that he accidentally threw in the garbage, you know, and it's like, you don't want to be that person, so you're going to jump on the next trend, and it turns out you will be that person sorting through the garbage trying to find. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. I would like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa Costa, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And as always, if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost it up on the charts and help us have a successful launch, and we'd appreciate it. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.